Muscle allows us to do every action of our day. If you can imagine walking upstairs, doing the dishes, walking to class, all of these things require the proper functioning of your muscle tissue. And unfortunately, muscle is very greedy. So if you don't intentionally train it, or if you're just aging, muscle can atrophy or decrease in size, and that decreased size leads to decreased strength. Fortunately, the good news is that with some basic principles of physiology that I'm going to share with you today, you can attenuate this loss and even gain strength and muscle growth, or hypertrophy your physiology. So we said before that muscle is a very lazy tissue. The reason for this is because it's very expensive for our body to create and maintain. So if we apply the lens of SAID, or specific adaptation to imposed demand, we can think about how we can drive our physiology to impose a demand for an adaptation that we're looking for, which in this case is hypertrophy or muscle growth. So how do we stimulate muscle growth? The biggest lever we can pull is volume, and volume can be broken down into sets. So how many sets of an exercise are we doing in the gym? The next is reps. How many reps per set are we doing? And then weight is just a way that we can modulate the intensity of our exercise. So for repetitions, I recommend 5 to 12 reps per set. And this is so you can get the best bang for your buck with volume, because if you're only doing one rep per set, that's more like a strength adaptation. So if you'd like to get stronger, lifting 405 on the deadlift, which I don't imagine most of you are, then you would decrease the repetition to below 5 repetitions per set. But for hypertrophy, the bandwidth, in my opinion, should stay between 5 and 12 repetitions per set. And for how many sets do you need to do each week? I would say 10 to 30 each muscle group. So this means spread across the entire week, you would be hitting your pectoralis muscle 10 to 30 sets. You would be hitting your back muscles 10 to 30 sets, your leg muscles, you get it. So this is just a way to ensure that you're getting the necessary volume to impose that demand to stimulate that muscle growth. And how much weight should you do, right? So this is an interesting question, because depending on where you are in your fitness journey, you might have never lifted a single weight. And if this is the case, I personally believe it's important to get down the movement pattern, the form, before you add any weight. So aim to complete each set about an RPE, and what that is a rating of perceived exertion. So 0 being sitting, 10 being, oh my God, I can't do another rep, which means like if you were to do another rep, you would have to compromise your form and it would just not be good. So I would say to train with a weight that gets you around RPE, or rating of perceived exertion, 6 to 9. An RPE of 9 means that you can do one more repetition once the set is done. RPE of 6 means that you can do 4 more repetitions. But if you could imagine an RPE of 4, that means when you complete a set, that you can do 6 whole repetitions after the set is done. And in my opinion, that might not be a sufficient stimulus to impose that demand for muscle growth. So those are some basic principles of volume, and how can we push that even further? I would say frequency. So how many times are you training each week? It depends on how busy you are, right? So Board et al. Found that 2 to 3 times per week training each muscle group provides a sufficient stimulus. So if you can sacrifice 2 days to do full body resistance training, you will see enough volume for that muscle growth that we're looking for. So putting it all together, we have 2 to 3 workouts per week with 5 to 12 repetitions for each set, of a total of 10 to 30 sets per muscle group. And if you are new to training, I would say focus on correct form before loading the movement patterns. And if you go to the gym, don't focus on what other people are doing. If someone's deadlifting 315, but you're still working on actually recruiting the proper muscles and the proper sequences, it's totally fine to just get a PVC pipe or a 45-pound bar and working on the movement pattern. So you can train for longevity, and you don't have to impress anybody. You're there for yourself, so meet yourself where you're at, and avoid injury by ego lifting, because that's what high schoolers do, and we would like to train more intelligently than that. So another piece of advice is to prioritize multi-joint movements over isolation movements as a general principle. And what I mean by that is I'd like you to do a squat variation or a leg variation, a push variation, and a pull variation. And the big three movements are a barbell back squat, a barbell bench press, a barbell deadlift, and pull-ups, I guess you could say. However, these are not very beginner friendly, so I would be totally fine if you, instead of a barbell bench press, chose a push-up with body weight. That would be a totally fine way to introduce that movement pattern into your repertoire. But I wouldn't want you to go into the gym and do some isolation movements like a bicep curl or a tricep curl and then just leave the gym, because that's a very poor use of your time. And the reason I say that is because once you do a large movement like a deadlift, you're pretty much using every muscle in your body, and it's very efficient in that way. We can stimulate a adaptation or a hypertrophy stimulus in a bunch of muscles very fast. And if you're going to isolate each muscle group for 10 to 30 sets a week, you'll be in the gym a lot longer than you need to be. So that's just my piece of advice. Focus on big compound lifts like bench pressing and deadlifting rather than isolation movements. So why should you care about increasing your muscle mass? It's been shown that inflammation in the form of C-reactive protein, which is just a correlate of inflammation, which can cause a lot of poor health outcomes, has been inversely correlated with exercise and muscle mass. So the more muscle mass you have, the more you can bolster yourself against inflammation. And that's just a prognostic of good health. Aging and strength. So when you age, your tendency is to lose about 1 to 1.4% of your lower extremity muscle mass each year, which is terrible because you're 30 years old, you're not an old person, but you're already declining in your peak strength. So what's cool about exercise training is that you can reduce this percentage, and you can even increase your percentage depending on where you're starting from. So sarcopenia is the age-related muscle mass that we're discussing. And what's interesting is that an 85-year-old lifetime lifter has been shown to have the same power and strength as a 65-year-old with the same power. So that's a 20-year training advantage. So if you can imagine being 95 but having the strength of a 75-year-old, that might seem unimpressive. But if you're a 95-year-old who can literally do things a 75-year-old can do because they've been intentional about how they live, that is an impressive feat just by implementing a resistance training program. So by training to increase your health span, you can prevent things like becoming frail. And what that means is some people are so, osteoporotic, which is just low bone mineral density. They're so low bone mass that when they go to sit down, their vertebra literally fractures under the weight of gravity. So if you can start voting for increased bone mineral density, increased muscle mass, increased strength, then prognostically, you'll be doing a whole lot better when you're 75 and you want to pick up your grandkids. So these are the kind of things that you should think about as reasons to start training for muscle mass. So what other behaviors can we be doing to optimize our muscle growth? The first thing is nutrition. This is huge because what are your muscles made out of? They're made out of protein. And when you consume things like a chicken breast or pea protein, then you're consuming those amino acids, which are quite literally the building blocks of that muscle that we're trying to grow. So if you're not eating a sufficient amount of protein, which in my opinion is 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, and this is theoretically a lot of protein compared to what the FDA standard would be, which would be 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight, which I think is the bare minimum to consume without seeing adverse side effects. So obviously consult your doctor before making a change in diet, but 1 gram per pound of body weight is a surplus of protein, so that when you go to train, you're flagging the muscle for growth. You can support that with the building blocks to actually produce that stable protein over time. And the next thing is sleep, because sleep is where you're actually building the amino acids into muscle fibers. So when you're in the gym, you're actually flagging the muscle for growth. You're destroying the muscle, you're damaging the fibers. But when you're sleeping, you are in a hormone environment to allow that growth to occur. So you have stress hormones like cortisol they're more catabolic, which means catabolic is to break down. So when you're stressed, you break down building blocks to mobilize energy. So like your fight or flight, you're like, we need glucose, ATP to sprint away from a jaguar. That's a catabolic cortisol environment. However, when you sleep, your cortisol decreases and you get anabolic hormones like growth hormone, which you might have heard before. So that is, you decrease your catabolic hormones, you increase your anabolic hormones, which means it's the perfect environment to build your muscle fibers. So this is why you should be sleeping 7 to 9 hours a night. I know that's might be a shock to some of you, but prioritizing your sleep does much more for your health than just building muscle fibers. So that's what I would recommend. So if you found value in this content, please like and subscribe and let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you all in the next video. Peace.